I promise I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome to today's video where we're going to be looking about the sympathetic nervous system. Let's go ahead and get started. What is sympathetic nervous system? It is that system which is going to be a branch of the autonomic nervous system. And this system is going to be activated in most cases when someone is under stress or even when someone is being chased by something which is very dangerous. It could be a dog, it could be a snake, or it could be even a thief who is trying to chase you. Okay, that is when we are going to be having the sympathetic nervous system being activated. So now we want to see that physiological process of how the sympathetic nervous system is going to be activated and how it is going to be causing changes in different parts of the body. That's our main target of today's video, okay? Because previously we talked about the preganglionic motor fibers, the postganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system, how they come out of the spinal cord. Now today we want to see how they take different kind of messages and innervate different structures of the body, okay? So let's go ahead and get started and see how the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, okay? So now here is going to be now a cross-section of what we call the brain and then the spinal cord. We want to see how the sympathetic nervous system gets activated. Now, for example, when you see a dangerous dog, the brain is going to receive this message. And it's going to be receiving this message through what we call one of the cranial nerve, and this cranial nerve is what we call the optic nerve. Okay, it's going to take the message to the brain, what we call the visual cortex. Okay, the visual cortex, which are going to be located on the posterior lobe. Okay, now once the visual cortex interprets this image and it looks to be very scaring, it is going to be sending that kind of message to tell one of these beautiful structure which is located in the brain, and this structure is what we call the limbic system. Okay, so once the visual cortex has relayed the information to the limbic system is going to be having different structures which are going to be responsible for emotional response, the kind of the fear, okay, and all those kind of responses. Why is this one very important? When the visual cortex sends the messages to the limbic system, in the limbic system, we have what we call fear centers, okay? And these fear centers are going to be one of the structure of the limbic system, which you may even call the amygdala, okay? So now, even for example, if the dog barks, okay, even also the auditory centers are going to send a message of this kind of the barking sound also to the what we call the limbic system, meaning that the visual cortex and then the auditory cortex, they are all going to be sharing the information to the limbic system. Okay, now once the limbic system receives this information, it is going to be weighing it and compare it with the previous information which it has and says, oh, this kind of the information is very dangerous, this person needs a lot of help. What it does, the limbic system is now going to send the information to one of the autonomic regulators of the body, which we call the hypothalamus. Okay, so now the limbic system is going to send the message to what we call the auto-regulator mechanism of what we call the hypothalamus. It is this hypothalamus which has the ability to regulate the functioning of this autonomic nervous system, which we call the sympathetic and then the parasympathetic nervous system. And also to regulate even all other autonomic functions like temperature, also osmolarity of blood, and it regulates a lot, okay? Now, what happens is that we have this kind of the hypothalamus. It has the sympathetic part and then the parasympathetic part. So now, when it gets stimulations from the limbic system, now, in this case, we need to suppress the parasympathetic nervous system and then activate the sympathetic nervous system. Now, once the sympathetic nervous system, let us assume that this red part is one which is going to be controlling the sympathetic part. So now it is going to be now sending the information down the axon. Okay, it's going to be sending the information down the axon through the brainstem, and then it goes into what we call the spinal cord. So now, the question is, where do we find sympathetic nervous system within the spinal cord? Because that's where the information is going to be coming and terminate from the brain, okay? So now we are going to be finding the sympathetic nervous system is going to be found on what we call the thoracolumbar outflow. We talked about that in the previous video, okay? That's why you're going to be having the cell bodies of the preganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system being located in the lateral horns. We talked about that, okay? So now once this information moves down, now it's going to be now stimulating all of these kind of the cell bodies of the preganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, once this happens, we shall have some kind of the preganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system moving all along, and they go and they synapse in what we call the adrenal medulla. Okay, and when terminates in the adrenal medulla, it's going to be releasing acetylcholine. Of course, acetylcholine is going to be now stimulating the adrenal medulla, leading to the production of what we call epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, these two chemicals, epinephrine and norepinephrine, is now going to be poured into the blood, and then they can go and act on all the body structures that are having receptors where this epinephrine and norepinephrine can stimulate. Okay, all the body structures that are having what we call the adrenergic receptors, they can be stimulated by these two chemicals. Okay, so now that's one. What else? Now, we are going to be having this kind of thoracolumbar outflow. It's going to be coming from what we call T1 down up to L2. Okay. So now we want to see how these preganglionic motor fibers come out of the spinal cord, and then they go and innervate different structures which you are seeing here. Okay. So now, for example, we have this structure here. This structure is what we call a chain ganglia, or what we call the sympathetic chain ganglia. Okay. And then these ganglia here you are seeing are what we call the cervical ganglia. And of course, we said that a ganglia is that collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. As simple as that. Okay. So now this kind of the ganglia, these ones here, are what we call the cervical ganglia, and this one on top, which is very, very, very big than the rest, this one here is what we call the superior cervical ganglia. Okay, is what we call the superior cervical ganglia. And then this one here, which back part B, is what we call the middle cervical ganglia. And then this one down here is what we call the inferior cervical ganglia. Okay, I'm just writing them cervical ganglia in short just because I don't want to congest this area. Okay, now these are the ganglia through which some of the preganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system are supposed to pass to go and innervate different structures of the head and even also the neck. Okay, so now let's see how they're going to be activated. So now, these are going to be now the cell bodies which are going to be located on the lateral horns of what we call the gray matter. Okay, we said that they're going to be located on the lateral horns. Okay, and then it comes out through what we call the ventral root, and then it moves through this ganglia. Okay, we said these are called the sympathetic chain ganglia. Now, for example, you're going to be having the preganglionic motor fibers coming out. They're going to be coming out. They pass through this chain ganglia. Okay, without synapsing, they move through the inferior, the middle, and then the superior. They are not going to be synapsing in this kind of the ganglia. Okay, they are going to be synapsing in this ganglia only. Okay, even we have also preganglionic motor fibers from T2. Okay, T2, they are not synapsing here. They are also moving. They go up to what we call the cervical ganglia. Also from T3. The preganglionic motor fibers, they are not synapsing, they are all moving up through this kind of the cervical ganglia. They go and synapse in what we call the superior cervical ganglia. Okay. So now, when it's the preganglionic motor fibers now synapses in this kind of the cervical ganglion from all these T1, T2, and T3, and synapses here. Now we are going to be having now the postganglionic motor fibers. Okay, the postganglionic motor fibers, they are going to be coming out. Okay, now these are going to be now the postganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system. Now they are going to be moving and moving and moving. Now, in the neck, we have on top of what we call the heart, we have what we call the common carotid artery, and in this common carotid artery is going to be splitting into what we call internal and then external carotid artery. Now, this kind of postganglionic motor fiber is going to be coming, and then it coils around what we call the internal carotid artery. Okay, so now, and then from there it will move and go and then innervate different structures in head and then the neck. Okay, so now this kind of the plexus which is going to be formed here is what we call the internal carotid plexus. Okay, you may even call it the carotid plexus. Okay, the carotid plexus. So now these postganglionic motor fibers are going to be coming and innervate these different structures. Okay, these postganglionic motor fibers are going to be releasing norepinephrine. Okay, and this norepinephrine is going to be acting on these different structures of the head and the neck, leading into what we call a physiological change. So now let's go ahead and see, during activation of the sympathetic nervous system, what is going to be the effect on these structures: the eye, the lacrimal gland, the salivary gland, and even also the blood vessels. We want to see what's going to be happening in these structures whenever sympathetic nervous system is activated. Okay. Now, we are going to be seeing release of what we call this branch going to the blood vessels. You can even see some branch going to what we call the salivary glands. We're also going to be seeing also a branch going to the eye. Okay, we're also going to be seeing a branch going to the eye, and even also we're going to be seeing another branch also going to what we call the lacrimal glands. So now we want to see what is going to be the effect of the neurotransmitters which is going to be released by these postganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system to these structures. Okay, so now what you should know is that the neurotransmitter which is going to be released is going to be what we call norepinephrine. Okay, so now what's going to be the effect on the blood vessels? The effect of this kind of the norepinephrine on what we call the blood vessels is going to be causing what we call vasoconstriction. Okay, vasoconstriction. Okay, they're going to be leading into what we call narrowing of the blood vessels. But we said that in some blood vessels, like for the case, those are blood vessels which are going to be supplying the skeletal muscles, whenever sympathetic nervous system is activated, they need to dilate because we need more blood flow to the skeletal muscles. So now here we're going to be having now the vasoconstriction. Now, what's going to be happening on what we call the salivary glands? You know, we have what we call extrinsic salivary glands, the parotid, the submandibular, and then the sublingual salivary glands. They are going to be they secrete saliva. But during stressful moment, someone is chasing you. Do we need this salivary gland to release the saliva? Anyway, we have these blood vessels which are going to be supplying these kind of salivary glands from where they get the different contents that make up the saliva. Now, if we have constricted these blood vessels which are going to be supplying these kind of the salivary glands, that means you're going to be making more of the saliva to be more thick, and the saliva is going to be more thick. Okay, so if the saliva is to be produced, you're going to be having what we call thick saliva. Okay, what we call thick saliva. Okay, that's going to be the effect on what we call the salivary glands, generally on all. Okay, so now how about the norepinephrine, which is going to be released on what we call the lacrimal glands? So now during stressful moments, we don't want to be lacrimating. Okay, we don't want tear production during this time. Okay, so now in other words, in case of the stimulation to what we call the lacrimal glands, we are going to be having a reduction. We're going to be having reduced lacrimation. Okay, reduced lacrimation. Okay, so now what's going to be the effect on what we call the eyes? Because it is also super very important. What's going to be happening on the lens? Okay, now because when something is chasing you and it's very dangerous, you would want to see very far. Okay, you'd want to see all the options where you can take and run away from it. Okay, or you may even want to see what other object you can pick down and then you hit. For example, it's a chasing dog. Okay, now we need to see some of the physiological changes whenever sympathetic nervous system is activated. What's going to be happening in the eye? Okay. Now, we have this kind of the ciliary muscle, okay, this kind of the ciliary muscles. Now, what's going to be happening on the ciliary muscles? Do we want the ciliary muscles to contract or we want them to relax? In this case, we want the ciliary muscles to relax, okay? We're going to be having ciliaris, okay? The ciliary muscles, we want them to relax, okay? We want them to what? To relax. What is the significance of this? Now, when these ciliary muscles relax, they are going to be exerting a lot of tension on what we call the suspensory ligaments. Okay? So now, when they exert a lot of tension to the suspensory ligaments, this will pull the lens and the lens will become more flat. Okay? And of course, when the lens becomes more flat, we are going to be having what we call the far vision. Okay? We're going to be seeing what we call the far vision. So now, the ciliaris muscle relaxation will aid in what we call the far vision. Okay, what we call far vision, which we call the accommodation. Okay, so now that's what's going to be happening on the lens. Now, how about the size of the pupil? Now, when you see this kind of the pupil, when you see this dark area here, we have just extracted only the eye. This is going to be now our pupil. Of course, the pupil is going to be that dark spot, which is going to be this dark one here. Now, if you zoom in and see this kind of this pupil around it, we are going to be seeing, you see this kind of these blue muscles, this kind of the blue muscles, they are what we call the sphincter dilator muscles. We may even just call them the sphincter muscles, okay? And then when you see these kind of these muscles which are going to be outside, like these red ones, they are going to be what we call the dilator pupilla, okay? So now, what's going to be happening in this case is that we need stimulation to what we call the dilator pupillae. And of course, if we make these dilator pupillae to contract, they are going to be now making the pupil to become more wide, because we need to see very far, okay? And in that way, if we make the pupil very wide, it means we're increasing the amount of light which is going to be coming inside, such that you can see a variety of options, okay? We don't have the effect of our sympathetic nervous system on what we call the sphincter muscles, okay? Now, it means that the dilator pupilla is going to be affected, or is going to be under the effect of the sympathetic nervous system, while the sphincter pupilla is going to be more of what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. This is going to be now the differentiating feature, okay? Meaning that during stressful moment, they are chasing you. We need the dilator pupillae to contract such that our pupil size becomes wide, okay? And of course, these dilator pupillae and then the sphincter pupillae, they are going to be now collectively making what we call the iris. And of course, we know it is the iris which regulates the size of the pupil, okay? It is such another beautiful thing. So now, what you're going to be seeing on the dilator pupilla is going to be what we call contraction, okay? These are going to be the dilator pupillae. We need the dilator pupillae to contract. Okay, we need what we call contraction of the dilator pupillae, which will widen the pupil such that you are able to see very well. Okay, this is such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now these are going to be the effect of the postganglionic motor fibers, which are going to be originating from the carotid plexus on these different structures of the head and the neck. Okay. Now, what else? We want to see what's going to be the effect on what we call the heart, the effect on the lungs, and even also this kind of the pipe which helps us to take the food into the stomach. We need to see what's going to be the sympathetic effect during this kind of stressful moment. Okay. Now, you're going to be having these kind of preganglionic motor fibers which are going to be coming. This time around, we have some of them which are going to be synapsing. We have some of them which are going to be synapsing with this kind of this ganglion, okay? And if they synapse here, you're going to be having now the postganglionic motor fibers coming out. And even also, here you're going to be having synapsing of them, and then we also have what we call the postganglionic motor fibers coming out, okay? And even also may have some fibers coming from what we call this kind of this ganglion, which we call the superior cervical ganglion. So now, this one collectively together, they are going to be now coming together, okay? Again, we may even have what we call the preganglionic motor fibers, which are going to be coming, and then they synapse on this ganglion. Okay, when they synapse on this ganglion, we're going to be having the postganglionic fibers coming out. Okay, even on T2, they're going to come, and then they synapse here, and then the postganglionic fibers are going to be coming out. Even also on T3, they'll come and synapse here, the postganglionic fibers comes out. Even also T4, they're going to be coming here, they synapse, then the postganglionic fibers comes out, and even also a small extent, also the T5, okay? We have what we call the postganglionic fibers coming out. So now they're going to be coming out, and then they unite, they form one of the most very important motor fibers, okay? So now these ones together, they're going to be forming what we call the cardiopulmonary plexus. Okay, are going to be forming what we call the cardiopulmonary plexus. And now this cardiopulmonary plexus, okay, we're going to be having now these fibers going to supply these different areas as we have just said. Okay, now we're going to be having some fibers which are going to be coming to supply the lungs. Okay, we need some fibers which are going to be coming all down to innervate what we call the heart. And then even also have some fibers which need to come and innervate what we call the esophagus. So now we want to see what is that sympathetic effect which is going to be exerted on the lungs, the esophagus, and then the heart whenever there is a stressful moment, okay? Now, starting with what we call the heart. These postganglionic motor fibers are going to be releasing what we call norepinephrine. And where is norepinephrine going to be binding? It's going to be binding on what we call beta-1 adrenergic receptors. And what's going to be happening? We have what we call a pacemaker. we have what we call the pacemaker, which we call the SA node. Now, once the norepinephrine binds on beta 1 adrenergic receptors on SA node, it's going to be increasing on the firing ability. Okay, it's going to be increasing on what we call the automaticity. Okay, so now in that way, we shall be having increased heart rate. Okay, we're going to be having what we call an increase in what we call the heart rate. Okay, and then also we have this kind of the beta 1 adrenergic receptors in the contractor in the myocardium. Okay, so now if you stimulate this myocardium, it means you're going to be having increased strong or the strength of the contraction is going to be increasing. And now if the strength of the contraction increases, it means you're going to be ejecting more blood off what we call the ventricles. Okay, it means you shall have what we call increased stroke volume. Okay, you're going to be having what we call increased stroke volume. Okay, so now increase in what we call heart rate, even what we call positive chronotropic effect. And then of course, whenever we increase the effect on what we call the strength of the contraction, we say what we call positive inotropic effect. So now if you increase stroke volume and increase heart rate, remember we have this formula which is called the cardiac output is going to be equal to heart rate, okay, heart rate times the stroke volume. Okay, now if you increase stroke volume and heart rate, it means you're going to be increasing cardiac output. But of course, we know that the blood pressure is going to be cardiac output times the total peripheral resistance. It means if you have increased the cardiac output, you have increased the blood pressure. That means during sympathetic outflow, we are going to be having increased blood pressures. Okay, it is just such another beautiful thing which is a must to know. Okay. During sympathetic outflow, we have increased what we call blood pressures. And now, these kind of the postganglion portal fiber, they are going to be part of the kind of the plexus we call the cardiac plexus. Okay, what we call the cardiac plexus. Okay, the cardiac plexus. Okay, so now that's going to be the effect on what we call the heart. Okay. Then what's going to be the effect on the esophagus? Now, the esophagus, during these stressful moments, we want to reduce the wave of the contraction, the peristaltic movement of the foods down the stomach. We want to reduce them, and even also to reduce any kind of the secretions within the esophagus. Okay, so now we are going to be reducing what we call the peristalsis. We're going to be reducing what we call the peristalsis, and even reducing for any secretion. Okay, any secretion. Okay, so now how do we call these fibers which are going to be stimulating this kind of causing this kind of the effect on the esophagus? This is going to be what we call the esophageal plexus. Okay, is what we call the esophageal plexus. Okay, esophageal plexus. Okay, this is such another beautiful thing. So now, what is going to be the effect on the lungs? You know, the lungs, we have what we call the bronchi. So now, in the stressful moments, we need more oxygen. So now, what's going to be happening to the diameter of the bronchi? The bronchi have to dilate and widen such that we suck in more oxygen. And when we suck in more oxygen, it means more ATP. Now, during this stressful moment, we need more ATP. That means we need more oxygen. So now our bronchi need to dilate such that they allow more entry of oxygen. Okay. So now we're going to be having dilatation of what we call the bronchi. Okay. We're going to be having what we call bronchodilation. Okay, we have what we call bronchodilation. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see what's going to be happening on the bronchi exactly. So now we want to first cut the whole of this kind of the bronchi. We zoom it here and see exactly what's going to be sympathetic effect on this kind of the bronchi. So now this is going to be now our cross section of the bronchi. We have just cut a small section. We want to see it and see how it's going to be the sympathetic effect on this. So now this is going to be now our lumen, and we're going to be having what we call the mucosa, and then also what we call the submucosa. Now we're going to be having now in the submucosa, we're going to be having, you see these blood vessels, see these arteries. These arteries are what we call the bronchial arteries. We need to see the effect of the sympathetic effect on the bronchial arteries. Okay. And then we even have what we call the smooth muscles. Okay, the smooth muscles are also going to be there. And then we even have what we call, you see these are glands. Okay, these are kind of the secretory glands that have to secrete some substances into the lumen of the bronchi. Okay, now We even have some other cells like the mast cells, okay? We want to see the sympathetic effect on all these structures, okay? For the case of the smooth muscles, okay, for the case of the smooth muscles, okay, for the case of the smooth muscles, we need them to contract or we need them to relax. In this way, we need them to relax such that the broncho diameter widens, okay? We need the smooth muscles to what we call to relax. That's going to be the sympathetic effect on the smooth muscles of the bronchi, okay? Now, how about what we call the broncho arteries? Okay, the broncho arteries. Now, we need the broncho arteries to constrict such that these kind of the glands, they do not get enough of the requirements for them to make what we call the secretions into the lumen. At this time, we don't need any kind of the secretion into the lumen. It will increase the resistance to the airflow. For that reason, we need the broncho arteries to constrict. Okay, we need the broncho arteries to what we call to constrict. Okay, we need them to constrict. So now, how about what we call of the mast cells? At this time, the mast cells, the moment they are stimulated, they may release a chemical called histamine, and this histamine has a tendency of causing what we call bronchoconstriction. So now we need this sympathetic effect to block the effect of what we call release of histamine. So meaning that this histamine, we need them to be blocked such that they don't release any chemical which will cause the bronchoconstriction. Because at this time, we don't need anything like narrowing of the air. We need to suck in more air, which means more ATP, which means more of the energy to run away from this kind of stressful moment. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now you're going to be having relaxation. We are going to be having a relaxation of the smooth muscles, which will make the lumen to widen the more. And also we shall have what we call, if you constrict these bronchial arteries, we shall have reduced mucus secretions into our lumen, okay? It is also such another beautiful thing. So now, how do we call this supply to what we call to the respiratory system? Now, this plexus is what we call the pulmonary plexus. Okay, the pulmonary plexus. So meaning that you're going to be having three plexuses coming off from this area. You're going to be having the cardiac plexus going to the heart. You're going to be having the esophageal plexus going to innervate the esophagus. And then we shall have what we call the pulmonary plexus going to innervate different structures in the respiratory system. Okay, so now let's just have a very simple quick recap of what we have just said. Okay. We have said that whenever someone is in a stressful moment or there is a dog which is going to be scaring you, you have seen a dog, you're going to be seeing the information going to hit the visual cortex, which will also send some messages also to the limbic system, and with the limbic system, through what we call the axons, will now go and activate what we call the sympathetic nervous system and then inactivate the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, through the descending axons, you're going to be having activation of these cell bodies of the preganglionic motor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system, which are going to be residing in what we call the lateral horns of the thoracolumbar region. Okay, and then we said that you're going to be having the preganglionic motor fibers from T1, T2, and T3 moving without synapsing in this chain ganglia, and then they move without synapsing in the inferior, and then in the middle they synapse in what we call the cervical ganglia, and then it will give off this kind of postganglionic fibers that forms this kind of the carotid plexus and go and innervate different structures. As we said it's going to be causing vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. It will cause into the production of more thick viscous saliva. It will also lead into reduced lacrimation or reduced tear formation, and also it will cause what we call ciliary muscle relaxation, okay, which will lead into exerting the tension of the suspensory ligament, which will make the lens to become more flat, which enables in what we call the far vision. Okay, we also said that that's going to be helping in what we call the contraction of what we call the dilator pupillae, which will widen the pupil such that there's more light entry into the what we call into the eye. Okay, that was the effect on what we call these structures of the head and the neck. And then we also said that we are going to be having these fibers which are going to be coming off from T1 up to T5, and then also supplement from what we call the cervical, the superior, inferior, and the middle ganglia also coming to form what we call the cardiopulmonary plexus. And of course, you're going to be having splitting of these postganglionic fibers, and they got different structures of these areas. And these structures, we have what we call the heart. Of course, going to be increasing the heart rate and also increasing what we call the strength of the contraction of the myocardium, which will increase the amount of the blood going to be ejected per beat, which is called stroke volume. And of course, we said that cardiac output is going to be heart rate times what we call the stroke volume. And of course, this is what we call the cardiac output. And of course, blood pressure is going to be cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. So now, if you increase cardiac output, you're going to be increasing the blood pressure, meaning that sympathetic effect to the heart is going to be increasing what we call the blood pressures, okay? And then we also said that the effect of the sympathetic effect of these postganglionic motor fibers on the esophagus is going to be reducing the peristaltic wave and also reducing what we call any kind of the secretion, because during this kind of the stressful moment, something is scaring you. We don't need any kind of secretions within the esophagus, okay? And we said that the kind of the plexus to the esophagus is what we call the esophageal plexus, okay? Then we said that we also have what we call the pulmonary plexus, which is going to be innervating what we call the different structures of the lungs. We said we have what we call the bronchi, and we said that the bronchi at that point we need them to dilate, okay? Meaning that smooth muscles within the bronchi, they have to relax such that they dilate and we increase more air entry. And of course, when we dilate these bronchi, we're going to be reducing what we call resistance to the air entry. More air will have to enter inside and more ATP. Okay, and we said that you're going to be having the broncho arteries constricting, because we don't want them to be bringing more of the contents to what we call this kind of the glands that will lead into increased secretions of what we call the mucus into the lumen, which we don't want in this kind of distressful moment. Meaning that the glandular secretions in sympathetic nervous system activation is going to be reducing, because we don't want anything like the mucus within the lumen, which will increase also the resistance. And at this time, we want also to reduce the what we call a broncho resistance, such that there is more air entry. Okay, and then we said that the sympathetic effect also on the mast cells is going to be causing the mast cells not to release any chemical like histamine, which also has the effect on what we call bronchoconstrictions. Okay. So now, and also said that these are going to be what we call the chain ganglia, or even what we call the sympathetic chain ganglia. And we said that these are going to be the cervical ganglia, where we have the spilia, which is the largest. Then we have what we call the middle and then the inferior cervical ganglions. Okay. So now this covers sympathetic nervous system supply to the head and the neck, and then some part of the chest. So now in the next video, we are going to be focusing on what we call sympathetic supply in some other visceral organs like in the GIT. Okay, that's going to be our next video, which is going to be part 2. Thank you very much for watching part 1. We meet in the next part 2. Tumnad as always, until we meet next time.